Some men think betrayal happens in an instant, that one day everything is fine, and the next your world caves in. They're wrong. Start slow, so slow you don't see it until it's too late. My name is Grant Stevens. I'm 48 years old, built like a man who's had to fight for everything he's ever had. I spent a decade breaking up fights as a bouncer before I made something of myself in private security. Now, I make sure men like me get paid to keep other men in line. I don't waste time with words, but when I do, people listen. Loyalty's the only thing that matters. You stick by your own or you're nothing. I was working late when I first noticed it. Nothing dramatic, just a little thing. A hesitation, a pause before answering me. Like she was choosing her words. Tessa sat at the kitchen table, flipping through one of those trendy magazines about art or culture or whatever else she pretended to care about lately. The TV played some forgettable news segment in the background, the hum of everyday life. But something felt off. "You want me to book that cabin for Memorial Day weekend?" I asked, leaning against the counter. We'd gone up to the lake every year since before the kids left home. It was routine. She barely looked up. "I don't know yet. Let's not plan too far ahead." That was new. Tessa was the type to plan things down to the minute. And since when did she hesitate over the lake? She loved that place, or at least she used to. "Not sure if you'll be free?" I kept my tone even. She pushed a lock of gray-streaked hair behind her ear, still not meeting my eyes. "I've just been thinking, maybe we should try something different this year." Different. A vague, nothing word. Told me everything I needed to know. I let it go for the moment, but my gut had already tightened. I didn't jump to conclusions. I observed. I'd made a career out of reading people, knowing when a man was lying, when he was about to throw a punch, when he was about to run. And Tessa? She wasn't the type to run, but she was hiding something. It got worse from there. The phone always face down. The late-night book club meetings that stretched later than usual. The way she suddenly cared about politics again, about ideas she used to roll her eyes at. "You ever feel like you're in a rut?" she asked me one night, out of nowhere. I looked up from my plate. Steak, potatoes, broccoli, same as always. "No." She let out a small breath, shook her head. "Must be nice." It wasn't frustration in her voice. It was something else. Resentment. A week later, my sister Clara called me after running into Tessa at the grocery store. "She was with some guy," Clara said, casual, but not really. "Didn't recognize him. Kind of bookish looking." "You know him?" I leaned against my truck in the parking lot of my office, jaw tight. "What did he look like?" "Tall, glasses, brown hair. Not exactly an underwear model." She hesitated. "They weren't doing anything, but it felt, I don't know, off. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't say anything to Tessa that night. Instead, I paid attention. To the way she smiled at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. To the way she started talking about new perspectives like she was suddenly some free-thinking philosopher. To the way she wasn't really here anymore, even when she was sitting right across from me. I waited. Let her feel safe, let her get comfortable. I was a patient man when I needed to be. But I wasn't stupid. The first time I saw his name, it was by accident. Tessa left her phone on the counter while she was in the shower, and it lit up with a message. "Kyle Cook." I didn't read the text. Didn't need to. A man doesn't text another man's wife late at night unless he's got business doing something he shouldn't. I let it sit there. Let it burn itself into my brain. I wasn't the type to react on impulse. That's what idiots did, the kind of men who punched drywall and shouted in parking lots. No, I'd been in this world long enough to know the value of waiting. You let a man think he's winning, let him get comfortable, and then you take everything from him. I started small. Tessa had always been careful with her phone, but people get sloppy when they think they're smarter than you. The next time she left it unattended, I glanced at her call log. Kyle Cook, 3 calls in the last 2 days. I looked him up later that night. Professor at Butler University. Philosophy, of course. The kind of guy who probably wore tweed jackets and talked about rethinking structures over craft beer. I knew his type. Men like that liked to think they were better than men like me. that they were more evolved because they read books about feelings and talked about freedom over overpriced espresso. But at the end of the day, he was sniffing around another man's wife, and that made him just another coward. I didn't confront Tessa. Not yet. Confrontation was for when you wanted an argument. I wanted control. A few days later, I made my move. Butler University needed extra security for a guest lecture series, and my company had the contract. I made a few calls, shuffled the schedule, and put myself on the detail. By 6 p.m. that evening, I was standing outside one of their stuffy lecture halls, arms crossed, watching a group of professors pat themselves on the back about some intellectual nonsense. And there he was. Cal Cook looked exactly how I pictured. Tall, glasses, just enough gray in his beard to make him look distinguished. The kind of man who called himself a thinker, but never lifted anything heavier than a hardcover book. I waited until he was alone, then approached. Dr. Cook. He turned, smiling, because men like him always assumed other men liked them. Yes. I offered my hand. Grant Stevens. Private Security. My company's covering your lecture series. He shook it, and I saw it. The way his grip was just a little too soft. The way he looked up at me like he was trying to figure me out. I already had him figured out. Oh, good to meet you, Grant. You do security for the university often. From time to time. Keeps me busy. I glanced around, keeping it casual. Funny thing, I think you know my wife. His smile flickered, just for a second. Barely enough for a man who didn't know what to look for. Tessa Stevens, I continued, watching him closely. She mentioned your name a few times. He covered well. Let out a thoughtful ah. Nodded like he was recalling something vague. Yes, Tessa, right, I believe we've had some discussions at the coffee house. Interesting woman. Sharp mind. I nodded. She is. He didn't ask any questions. Didn't mention anything specific. That told me everything. If there was nothing going on, he would have asked how I knew her, why she mentioned him. But he didn't. He just nodded and tried to move on. I wasn't going to let him. You ever need security advice? Let me know, I said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. I felt him tense. Not just for events. Personal security, too. You'd be surprised how many guys don't realize how vulnerable they are until it's too late. He laughed, a nervous little chuckle. I suppose that's true. I smiled, just enough to let him see there was nothing friendly about it. That was step one. By the time I walked out of that university, I knew two things. One, he was involved with Tessa. And two, he had no idea what kind of man he was dealing with. Tessa had no idea I knew. That was the part one enjoyed most. People like her, like Cook, they thought they were clever. Thought they were subtle. But subtlety doesn't work on a man who spent his life reading people, watching for every twitch, every hesitation. She was making plans. Plans that didn't include me. I let her. The first step was making Cook uncomfortable. I started small. When Tessa mentioned her discussion group one evening, I asked just enough questions to make her tread carefully. What's the topic this week? I asked over dinner, cutting into my steak. She took a little too long to answer. Freedom, she finally said. Freedom, I repeated. Hell of a thing. Lot of people want it. Not a lot of people earn it. She looked at me then, studying my face. I just kept eating. Let the words sit. The next time I saw Cook, I made sure it was somewhere he wasn't expecting me. The university gym. Not a place I imagined he spent much time, but I knew a guy who worked there. Asked him to check the faculty logs. Turns out Cook had started using the weight room twice a week. Probably some pathetic attempt to impress Tessa. So I showed up. He was stretching when I walked in, wearing one of those moisture-wicking shirts that clung to his soft academic frame. I made sure to wait until he saw me before I nodded and grabbed a barbell. Grant, he said, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should acknowledge me. Doc, I said back, loading up my weights. I could feel his eyes on me as I pressed the bar over my head. I didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him again. Just let him sit with the knowledge that I was there, that I was watching. A few days later, I started planting seeds. A buddy of mine, former military, did some cybersecurity work on the side. For a small favor, he did a little digging. Nothing illegal, just the kind of public records most people don't think about. Turns out, Cook's faculty contract was up for renewal. That was good information. It meant he had something to lose. So I made sure he started losing. First, I sent an anonymous tip to the university. Just a little note about a professor engaging in an inappropriate relationship. Didn't name names. Didn't have to. The rumor alone was enough to put a microscope on him. Then, I had a casual conversation with a reporter I knew. Small time but eager. Dropped a hint about a local professor who liked to blur professional and personal lines. A week later, the university was buzzing about an investigation. Cook started looking over his shoulder more. Started checking his phone in that paranoid way people do when they know something's slipping out of their hands. Tessa noticed. One night, she came home tense, quiet. I sat on the couch, beer in hand, watching her move through the house. Tough day? I asked, not looking away from the TV. She hesitated just for a second. Yeah. Anything you want to talk about? No. I let it go. Let her feel the weight of keeping secrets. A few days later, I took it further. I found out where Cook liked to grab coffee in the mornings, some little indie place downtown. I got there first, sat at the counter, and waited. When he walked in, I made sure to catch his eye, then waved him over. He hesitated but came over anyway. Grant, he said cautiously. Morning, documents, sit down. He did. I sipped my coffee, let the silence stretch. Then I leaned in, lowering my voice. How's work treating you? He frowned, shifting in his seat. Fine. Yeah? I let my gaze settle on him. Heard some rumors going around. Some investigation? His hand tightened around his cup. Look, I don't know what you think. I cut him off with a small chuckle. Relax, document. I'm just making conversation. I leaned back, casual, taking another sip. Funny thing about reputations, though. One bad rumor and suddenly people start looking at you different. Doors start closing. Contracts don't get renewed. He didn't respond. Just stared at me, jaw tight. I smiled. Enjoy your coffee. Then I got up and left. He was already unraveling. I could see it. And I wasn't even close to done. Cook started breaking before he even realized it. That's the thing about men like him, they build their lives on words, ideas, the illusion of control. But when something real presses down on them, something they can't talk their way out of, they crack. I kept the pressure steady. Didn't have to do much, just let the weight of everything pile onto his shoulders. The university kept their investigation quiet, but it wasn't hard to make sure the rumors didn't die. A few well-placed comments to the right people, a suggestion here, a raised eyebrow there. Before long, the faculty was whispering, students were speculating, and Cook was walking around campus like a man waiting for the floor to drop out beneath him. Tessa started noticing, too. She was on edge, more cautious, like she knew something was shifting but couldn't figure out what. The phone calls got shorter. The late nights got fewer. She came home distracted, lost in her head. One night, she was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone like it held all the answers in the world. I leaned against the counter, watching her. Something wrong? I asked, casual. She blinked, startled, then locked the screen and set the phone down. No. Just tired. I let that sit for a second, then nodded. You still thinking about that different vacation? She glanced up, guarded. Maybe. Where were you thinking? She hesitated. That was all I needed to see. She hadn't thought that far ahead because she never planned on taking me anywhere. Not sure yet, she finally said. I pushed off the counter, stretched. Let me know when you figure it out. Then I walked out, leaving her sitting there, picking at the lie in her head. A few days later, I decided it was time to push Cook over the edge. I called in a favor with an old friend in media. Just a little anonymous tip about a local professor involved in a scandalous affair. Nothing concrete, just enough for the tabloids to bite. Within 48 hours, his name was floating around on a couple of gossip sites. Nothing big, but just enough that people started asking questions. Tessa came home that night looking pale. She threw her purse down, pacing the kitchen. I sat at the table, pretending to scroll through my phone. You okay? I asked without looking up. She let out a sharp breath. Something's going on at the university. I finally looked up, waiting. Kyle, he's in trouble. Someone's spreading lies about him. He might lose his job. I nodded slow. That's so. She gave me a look, searching for something in my face. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Why would I? Silence stretched between us. She didn't answer, didn't accuse. She just stood there, jaw tight, hands clenched. She was starting to put the pieces together, but she wasn't sure yet. Good. That meant I wasn't done. The next day, I sent the final blow. A well-placed email to a reality TV show that thrived on scandals. They picked it up fast. Married woman's affair with local professor exposed. The article wasn't even well-written, but it didn't matter. It spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, Cook's office was empty, his email deactivated. The university cut him loose without hesitation. Tessa found out that night. She came home late, looking wrecked, like she'd been crying. She dropped into the chair across from me, shaking her head. They fired him. Her voice was hoarse, disbelieving. His life is ruined. I didn't react. Just set my beer down and looked at her. Maybe he should have made better choices. Her head snapped up, and for the first time in years, I saw something real in her eyes. Fear. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then closed it. I stood up, grabbed my jacket. I'm going for a drive. She didn't stop me. Didn't say a word. Just sat there, staring at the wall like she was realizing, for the first time, exactly who she had married. I walked out the door, feeling lighter than I had in months. Cook was finished. And Tessa? She was just getting started on her own destruction. Tessa didn't talk much after that night. She moved through the house like a ghost, quieter, slower, like she was waiting for something to snap. Maybe she thought I'd yell, throw things, demand answers. She didn't understand that I'd already won. There was nothing left to fight over. Cook disappeared. Last I heard, he'd packed up and left town. The university cut him loose, his reputation shot, his name dragged through enough gossip sites that no decent school would touch him. He wasn't answering Tessa's calls anymore, not that she admitted to trying. But I knew. The way she gripped her phone, checking it every few minutes, hoping for a message that never came, it was all there, written in her body language. He was done with her. She sat at the kitchen table one night, stirring a glass of whiskey she hadn't touched. I sat across from her, taking my time finishing off my dinner. It had been 3 days since Cook got exposed. You want to ask me something? I finally said. Her eyes flicked up, wary. Should I? I shrugged. Seems like you've got a lot on your mind. She let out a slow breath, set the glass down. Did you do it? I leaned back in my chair, watching her. Do what? She shook her head like she already knew the answer but wanted to hear me say it. Kyle? His job. His reputation. The article. I let the silence stretch. Then I picked up my beer, took a slow sip, and set it down. Actions have consequences. Her fingers curled into fists. You didn't have to ruin his life. I smirked. Didn't have to? What, you think I should have just sat here, let you keep sneaking around, let him keep thinking he could take what's mine? I leaned forward, voice low. You made a choice. So did he. And I made sure you both lived with it. She swallowed hard, looking away, shame creeping into her expression. Good. She should feel it. Should sit with it, let it eat at her. She got up without another word and disappeared upstairs. The door to our bedroom closed softly behind her. A month ago, I might have followed. Not anymore. The fallout came fast. People talk even in a city like this. Friends stopped calling. The women she used to meet for lunch suddenly had excuses. Her job at the art gallery dried up, her boss quietly pushing her out when the whispers got too loud. She stopped dressing up. Stopped doing her hair. The woman who used to walk through life like she owned every room she entered now barely made eye contact when we ran into someone we knew. The final blow came from her grandmother, the only family she had left. I came home one evening to find Tessa sitting at the kitchen table, a letter in front of her. She didn't move when I walked in, just sat there, staring at the words. I picked up the envelope. The return address was familiar, her grandmother's nursing home in Ohio. I pulled out a chair, sat across from her. She cut you off, didn't she? Tessa nodded, eyes glassy but dry. I didn't say I told you so. Didn't have to. She was the only one who ever believed in me, she whispered. Guess she changed her mind. Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry. Just sat there, hollowed out from the inside. I finished my beer, stood up, and walked away. There was nothing left to say. Tessa stopped trying after that letter. She went through the motions, got up, got dressed, made coffee, but there was nothing behind it. She didn't go out much anymore, didn't try to fix things. She knew there was nothing left to fix. Some nights she'd sit on the couch, staring at the TV without watching. Other nights she stayed in the bedroom, door closed. I didn't ask what she did in there. Didn't care. The house felt quieter without the lies. I kept living. Work kept coming in and I made sure to keep moving forward. I spent more time with my sister Clara, met up with my old buddy Ian for beers at the bar we used to bounce at. He was the kind of guy who didn't ask too many questions, but he gave me a look one night after we'd knocked back a couple rounds. Heard your old lady's been having a rough time, he said, tipping his bottle toward me. I smirked, shaking my head. Her own fault. He let out a low chuckle, took a sip. Damn right. Clara wasn't as subtle. She cornered me at a diner one afternoon, pushing her coffee aside and folding her arms. So that's it, she asked. I looked up from my plate. That's what? You're just letting her rot? I took my time chewing, wiped my mouth, then set the napkin down. What do you want me to do, Clara? Pat her on the back? Tell her it's okay. She sighed, shaking her head. I don't know. I just thought. What? That I'd forgive her? That we'd have some big heart-to-heart? I leaned in. She made her choice. She didn't give a damn about me when she was sneaking around. She only cares now because she lost. Clara looked away, jaw tight. You used to love her. I let out a short breath, sat back. Used to. That was the thing. There was no anger left in me. No sadness. Just an empty space where something used to be. Tessa started drinking more. Not enough to be sloppy, not enough to be obvious, but I knew. The whiskey bottles disappeared faster, and sometimes I'd hear her moving around the kitchen at odd hours, the faint clink of glass against the counter. One night, I found her standing in the backyard, staring up at the sky. She must have heard me step outside because she didn't turn, just spoke into the night. Do you ever think about how we got here? I crossed my arms. No. She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Of course you don't. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I didn't plan for this. I tilted my head. What did you plan for? She finally looked at me, and for the first time in a long time she didn't look defiant. Just tired. I thought I could have both. I nodded like that made sense. Because in her head it probably did. She thought she could keep the stability, the house, the life we built while chasing whatever thrill Cook gave her on the side. Thought she was the smart one, the one in control. She never saw the cliff until she was already falling. I didn't say anything else, just turned and went back inside. 2 weeks later, she packed a bag and left. Didn't say where she was going, didn't ask if I cared. Just walked out the door without looking back. I watched her drive away, then shut the door and locked it behind her. She was finally someone else's problem. A man doesn't need closure. He needs resolution. And mine came the day I stood at my father's grave, the morning air cold against my skin, the sky stretched wide and empty above me. The old man never had much to say, but what he did say stuck. You take care of what's yours. And when someone spits on that, you don't cry about it. You handle it. Then you move on. That's what I did. Tessa was gone. No messages, no late-night calls, no dramatic attempts to fix something that couldn't be fixed. I heard through Clara that she moved to some cheap apartment on the edge of town that she kept to herself, didn't go out much. I didn't ask for details. Didn't care. She wasn't my wife anymore, not in any way that mattered. Cook? Last I checked, he was struggling to find work. Academia had a long memory, and his name had been dragged through enough dirt that no respectable university wanted him. A couple of freelance writing gigs, some desperate attempts at online lectures, but nothing that stuck. No more tenure. No more influence. Just another burned-out intellectual trying to claw his way back from a fall he never saw coming. I left them both in the past where they belonged. Work kept rolling in. The security business was good, steady, reliable. I hired a couple more guys, trained them up. A kid named Liam started working for me, barely 18, fresh off some bad decisions. Reminded me of myself at that age, angry, looking for direction. I gave him work, kept him busy. Better to have him watching my back than wasting his time getting into trouble. One afternoon, I was at the bar with Ian when Clara showed up, sliding into the booth across from me. She set her drink down and gave me a long look. You good? I took a sip of my beer, let the silence sit for a second. Yeah. She nodded, but her eyes were searching. You don't miss her? Even a little? I smirked, shaking my head. I miss what I thought she was. That's not the same thing. Clara let out a breath, leaning back. Cold? No, I said. Just done. That was the truth of it. I wasn't bitter. Wasn't carrying some weight in my chest, waiting for something to make it right. It was right. They made their choices. I made mine. And now the only thing left to do was keep moving. I finished my beer, checked the time, then stood up, grabbing my jacket. Come on, I said to Ian. We've got work in the morning. Clara shook her head, watching me go. You ever gonna slow down? I pulled my jacket on, glanced back at her. Why the hell would I? I walked out, the door swinging shut behind me. The night was crisp, the air clean. Everything felt exactly the way it should. Solid. Settled. Done. Some men spend their whole lives chasing justice, begging for it, waiting for some invisible hand to set things right. Not me. I don't wait. I don't beg. I take care of what's mine. And then I move forward. That's what men do.